and Audacity in 3, 2, 1.
Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co-host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Krista Scott-Dixon, and we would love it if you could introduce yourself to our audience and hear a little bit more about your background.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Krista Scott-Dixon. I'm the Director of Curriculum at Precision Nutrition. And if you don't know who Precision Nutrition is, we are the world's largest, as far as I know, online nutrition coaching certification company. We also do nutrition coaching. We make nutrition coaching software. And then, of course, recently we've expanded beyond this into more like a health coaching thing. So we have clients and coaching students all over the world, and we have to offer curriculum for them. And so my job involves making the curriculum that our nutrition coaching clients and our coaching students will see. So that's everything from creating textbooks to online courses, short, long, everything in between. And since we've moved into a more holistic health coaching approach, it's really kind of my job involves kind of knowing a little bit of everything about everything. So that's that's kind of what I do.
So that makes you a perfect person to talk to today, knowing a lot of things about a lot of things. But we'll keep it to just a few topics. But yeah, I'm excited to have you on. PN has been awesome and really instrumental. And I know both of our businesses I think PN really leads the holistic side of nutrition coaching, and we'll get into like why that shift is needed. But yeah, I think it's really helped a lot with just like broadening our mindsets as a whole around nutrition and eating. And yeah, so I'm excited to dive in. So first, before we do that, like kind of just tell us like your backstory of how did you get to the place where you're doing all the curriculum for all the things and doing everything that you do.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a circuitous journey. I certainly was not like formally, like that was, when I went into university in 91, I was like, I didn't have fitness and health in any way on my mind. I was like biology in high school. Like that was always kind of the thing I enjoyed, but I didn't consider myself, in any way athletic. I was always the kid that was picked last for teams, like all of that stuff. And then, as I went through university and especially in grad school, like if you've been a grad student, it is not the healthiest lifestyle. It was lots of, beer and chicken wings and sitting on my butt for long hours. And so, progressively, I kind of got more and more out of shape. And I had taken one course in high school that I really loved, which is the only gym class I, managed to take, which was weightlifting. And I was like, this is really cool because I can't catch a ball. I hate team sports. But this weightlifting thing, like this is pretty neat. So that was like in the 80s. And then when I kind of got out of shape as a grad student, I was like, all right, like I remember weightlifting being cool. And, for the younger listeners, I know that makes me sound really old, but like for the younger listeners, like you have to understand that during this time, there was no information about women's weightlifting. Like women were specifically told, never lift weights. You will get huge and disgusting and blah, blah, blah. You'll hurt yourself, all of these things. So you couldn't find information. There was no internet per se, like not like it is now. So you couldn't find information about serious women's training except at a university, which is where I was. And so I would go into like the science library and look up physiology textbooks and that kind of stuff. And so, I kind of taught myself a lot of health and fitness stuff alongside my other graduate studies in another discipline. And then, I got my PhD and I did 5 years in academia, being faculty and doing research and teaching. And then I was like, nah, academia is not for me. And I left. But I'd had this kind of parallel practice on the side. I'd been working as a personal trainer for a number of years. Like once I got myself in shape, I started helping other people. And so I was like, I could probably make a pretty good money as a self-employed personal trainer. So I did that for a little while, but I'd known the guys from Precision Nutrition. So at this point, Precision Nutrition was just kind of like a startup. They had maybe 7 people. And, they were like, hey, listen, we're a couple of dudes, like we know the bro market, but we don't really know the market for women. We don't really know how to, talk about women's fitness. So could you come on and kind of help us, speak to female consumers and also help edit our textbook, which is, it was like the first edition of the level 1 nutrition certification. And it was very dense and quite unreadable, and so I got in there and I helped edit their textbook and make it more accessible. and yeah, it just kind of grew from there. And, then they had very high enrollments for coaching, and they were like, hey, do you think you could be a coach? And I was like, I don't know, that seems easy, right? And then so I coached a number of cohorts, and then I just, kind of progressively went into doing their curriculum because I had this background in academia, and I just kind of ended up here in a way. So, but it certainly was not planned. It was not something I ever intended to do, for sure.
Yeah. Remind me, what was your actual PhD in then? You said it's in a different field.
Totally. It was in women's studies.
Right.
And whenever I say women's studies, everyone's like, what even is that? I'm like, well, studying 51% of the world's population. But, at the time it was a lot of stuff around women's work in technology, like women's employment. So paid work, unpaid work, women's work in healthcare, women's work in technology, women working in scientific fields. So that was kind of my jam. And then that kind of like moved into like healthcare, really thinking about things like occupational health. So I worked in occupational health for a while. But it's funny, like I remember kind of gloating about this because again, everyone's like, oh, women's studies, what is that? And, years later, I was able to help out the folks at Girls Gone Strong, for example, with some kind of expert review on their materials. So, it's funny how these things come around. If you're someone listening that, is interested in health and fitness and has a degree in another field or thinking of changing careers, and is worried like, oh, I'm not good enough, or I was not an athlete, or what, like, am I allowed to study in this field? Absolutely. Because I think you bring in a unique perspective that maybe someone else wouldn't have. So yeah, I think there's lots of pathways into health and fitness. And so that was just mine.
Yeah. Well, Christina her background's in school counseling.
Mm-hmm.
My background is in neuroscience. So it's funny how I ended up here.
I actually have a minor in women's studies. I don't know if you knew that.
I didn't.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever mentioned that.
Yeah, I have a minor in family studies and women's studies.
Okay.
Huh.
Yeah. Fun fact.
Nice.
Nice to know you're keeping the discipline going.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much. Yeah. Yeah. But it's, like you said, like none of us have a degree in exercise science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so, we're all here. We're all clearly doing fine, at least. And yeah, so that's awesome. And I think, it brings into discussion kind of the first topic that I want to dive into with you today, is we'll get into, before we even talk about overeating or emotional eating or stress and how all of that plays into it. Christina and I were actually just talking earlier about kind of our journey with tracking our food, our nutrition, just goals, and how our mindsets have shifted around our nutrition over time. So, I think it would be a really great thing to hear your perspective on why nutrition is so much more than macros and why nutrition is so much more than fat loss. I actually saw a really good Instagram post the other day. Someone was talking about how like someone assumed that her giving nutrition advice was weight loss advice, but that those two things are not synonymous. Same thing as, tracking macros. That's not all there is to nutrition. So yeah, I would love to hear your take on that, because I know you have a very good and nuanced perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to consider it in the historical context, right? Because, nutrition and food and eating have meant all kinds of things to all kinds of people through the years. And it's really only quite recently that we associate good nutrition, I'm putting this in finger quotes because you can't see, with losing weight. I mean, this is a very recent development, relatively speaking, in human history. And even macros is a very recent concept. And so like, my mother was a hospital dietitian for many years, and she always had this interest in nutrition. And so when I was growing up in, the 70s and 80s, like in the 80s, low fat was really big. Like everyone was obsessed with heart disease. Low fat was the jam. We were buying all kinds of low fat products, like low fat Snackwells and stuff like that. So we were like finding ways to eat cookies that were just like low fat, right? And so now witnessing macros in 2022 always seems a little bit weird to me because, we go through these phases where a certain way of eating is kind of elevated as like, this is it. This is the secret. This is the magic formula. This is the system that is going to get you what you want. That is somehow magically going to transform you into, whatever it is that you seek. And for a lot of people, it is weight loss, right? Because we currently live in a society where the abundance of food and very hyper palatable or tasty, delicious, hard to stop eating food, is fairly immediately accessible to most of us, coupled with the fact that we don't do as much activity as we used to, like even just kind of getting around in daily life. So, many of us are walking around with more fat on our bodies than we would prefer for whatever reason. So, it's not surprising that we link nutrition to weight loss, because good nutrition is a part of it. But, ideally, what I try to encourage with people is to think beyond these very narrow concepts of what good eating is. So the macros concept is basically, look, we can break down all foods into these 3 macronutrients, right? Protein, fat, carbohydrates. And by applying this 3-part formula to everything we eat, we can somehow produce an outcome that magically, again, gets you what you want. And to me, this is just like an unbelievably oversimplified understanding of even what food is, right? Like, first of all, very few foods are just one kind of macro or another. Most foods contain a mix of macros. But within the label of, let's say, proteins or fats or carbohydrates, there may be dozens or hundreds of molecules that fit that description that don't behave equally in the body. So, under the umbrella heading of carbohydrate, we have simple sugars, we have more complex sugars, we have starches, we have things like cellulose, like the stuff that give trees, like the rigid structure, right? So, to kind of make it all about, oh, how many carbs are you eating? It's like, am I eating sugar? Am I eating potatoes? Am I eating a tree bark? Like, like what am I eating here? To reduce it to that, I think really misses a lot about the incredible complexity of all of the nutrients that are in food, not just macros, but also, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, a whole variety of compounds that are in plants, myconutrients, fungi, mushrooms, zoonutrients, which are in, animal foods. So like nature has offered us this incredible symphony of chemicals that we consume in our foods. So to reduce it to macros is just like unbelievably oversimplifying and almost in a way like degrading the eating experience. Like, is this what we want from our food, to just be like fat, proteins, and carbs? Like, is this how we all want to live our lives?
I've seen it.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I've seen some people describe, like, once they've started tracking macros, they like view things as like a matrix where all they see is protein, carbs, and fats. Like they don't see their food anymore.
Yeah, that just seems tragic. I imagine like across the pond, like Italians just going, why? Like, why are you doing this to food, right? Or any other food loving culture. I mean, it's such a way to commodify the experience of eating. And for most people, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. Most people have no requirement to eat this way. Now, it can be helpful to know, what's in your food, right? This is a food that's higher in protein. Cool. This is a food that's higher in carbohydrates. This is a food that's higher in fiber, whatever, right? I think having a basic understanding of what's in your food can be very helpful, especially in terms of meeting our basic requirements, right? So with a lot of clients, a lot of folks are not eating enough protein, right? They're not eating enough fiber, or they're eating fat, but they're not eating what we would think of as like the essential fats or the healthy fats, right? So it certainly is useful to understand what's in your food. But it's almost like you think about like when the roller coaster crests, right? Like once we get over the peak of understanding, you have very diminishing returns on whether this is a useful paradigm to eat by.
Absolutely. And one thing I picked up on what you said is so important is like the experience of eating. And so kind of backtracking a little bit, but food is so much more than fuel, and macros are a great tool to help us maybe remove some emotional, value from food if it's necessary, right? Because a lot of people do struggle with emotional eating or stress eating, and maybe that's helpful for them to assign a different value other than just a coping mechanism to food. But also on the flip side of that, food is social. Food is emotional. Food is a part of culture. It's a part of so much more than just macros. And so I think it's definitely a great point on your part that, there are very few cases in which like macros are truly the solution. I would even venture to say that when those cases arise that like someone's so data driven and they love it and it just suits them so well, it's still temporary.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we always want to be considering as coaches, like, what's the point? What's the point of any of this, right? Like, let's really stop and think about why we are doing this. Does this suit the person in front of me? Is this a good fit for this person? And you mentioned the data-driven people. Yeah, there is like that, I don't know, maybe 5% of clients. Usually they're engineers or they work in some kind of technical field and they just love numbers and it brings them joy, right? And so my question is always like, is this bringing you joy? Are you really engaged in this? Does it feel good to you? And not just like for a week when you're high on a new project, but like, long term, does this feel good and energizing and sustainable? Does it spin your dials in a really healthy and productive way? And if so, knock yourself out. By all means, keep doing it. But for most people, that's really not their experience. Again, once they get past the basic knowledge, then it just becomes another way to control their eating. Or, you mentioned emotional eating. A lot of people feel guilty when they go, quote unquote, off their macros. Oh, I ate too many carbohydrates. I went off my macros. I did this, I did that. So, in a way, we don't want to set up another system for failure, for perceived failure and frustration for people. So ultimately, our goal, winning the game here as coaches, is finding a way that makes food understandable for people, that allows them to eat in ways that support their deep health goals sustainably. So sometimes it's a short-term fix, right? Maybe for a week we track your intake just so you get to know, like, what are you eating? And you're like, oh, a tablespoon of peanut butter is sadly way smaller than the amount that I'm eating, right? Everyone has those like proverbial come to Jesus moments, but tracking your food for the rest of your life, probably not viable for most people. So we also don't want to confuse like short-term tactics with a longer-term strategy and longer-term vision for how people want to live their lives. Unless you are getting paid for your body, the precise proportion of macronutrients is not a hill that you need to die on. And in fact, if we start to layer in other aspects like behavior change and people's daily routines and just the constraints of real life, we effectively ask our clients to do a lot of tasks that they're unequipped for. So if I say to you, you have to eat, I don't know, 32% protein, let's just pick that as a random number. Now I'm asking my client to do a whole set of skills. You have to know what foods have protein. You have to go shopping for it. You have to know how to prep it. You have to have it available in your daily menu. You have to eat the right exact quantity of it. And you have to do that consistently. Now, that may sound really simple to people who have been training all their life to do this kind of thing, but it's not at all simple for people who don't have those skills, who are simply butting up against the constraints of real life. I mean, Christina, you have a new baby, right? Like, precise macro eating is out the window. And I'm sure it was when you were pregnant too, right? Because there's all kinds of weird food aversions and things that happen, right? So, for most people within the constraints of reality, asking them to hit particular macros is not only ineffective, it creates massive anxieties and the opportunities for quote unquote failure. And it puts people's focus on completely the wrong thing, which is eating according to an arbitrary external standard. So for all of these reasons, I'll pause now for reactions and clarifying questions. But for all of these reasons, I'm really not a huge fan of that. And I think we can do much, much better in terms of how we coach people to eat better.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really big point where it's like, when you talk about macros is just like a simpler version. And it's kind of, I feel like some coaches it's like the same thing as like calories in, calories out. Like, that's the only thing that matters when it comes to losing weight. So just kind of like these simple messages and we get behind, but I love that there's so much more behind it. And again, really taking in the, like you were saying, the real world experiences and how something might work for someone else, but it may not work for everyone. So I there's so much I want to talk about from what you just said. But I know Marissa has a ton of questions too.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I love that you said was kind of how macros can almost attach like morality to like nutrition for people, where like if I kind of the mindset of if I'm on my macros, therefore I am good, and if I am off my macros, therefore I am bad. And right, it's like it's a tool that we can use in certain circumstances, but like as soon as we get morality into it, then we open the doors for self-sabotage, guilt, shame, and just those toxic cycles that can really start to happen, whether that's from a restrictive quote unquote fad diet or it's from macros. Like it can be treated the same way when we attach something like our morality to the outcome of, do we hit the numbers or do we not? Do I follow the rules or do I not? I think it's also very nuanced though, because like there are people who require a certain amount of structure to feel clear on something, right? Where they enjoy the structure of knowing maybe I need some odd number of calories to be in a deficit and lose the body fat that I need to lose for X deadline, right? And if we throw at them, okay, I just want you to be mindful of your food intake. I'm going to use like a very general example for sake of like example, but like let's say that's the only directive they get. You know, we've had clients be like, I'm so confused. I don't know what that means or what to do. So it's striking this unique balance between having enough structure to where the person is clear, they understand what needs to be done and how they need to execute on something, but also not getting to that place where it's so rigid or they're not equipped for any of the things that they are being told to do, and just finding like truly just meeting people where they're at and finding where that middle ground is for them there. Something that we've done with our coaching program is we've kind of created this pyramid. It's like a play on Eric Helms's pyramid, but the first level is just mindfulness and basic habits. The second level is we start thinking about food quality, protein, fruits, vegetables. And then the third one is we might get into tracking calories or macros, but most people don't even get past those first two levels. So I love what you said there, especially kind of getting into the discussion of like how we can view it as so black and white.
Well, and I think implicit in what you're saying, you said earlier too, is that for some reason in the industry, we set up a lot of false dichotomies. It's almost like that would you rather game, right? It's like, so you have all these arguments about like, you know, squats are crap. No, squats are amazing. Deadlifts are crap, right? And it's like, we can do all the things, right? And so people often treat a lot of these things as very mutually exclusive. Like I saw a video the other day where it was some carnivore guy going on of like, what would you rather eat? All meat or all vegetables? I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's more options than that. Like we can eat some meat and some vegetables. Like it's just such a ridiculous kind of thought experiment, right? And so a lot of people will say, oh, but like mindfulness doesn't work because blah, 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 or numbers don't work because blah, blah, blah. The first thing we want to think about is who's the person in front of us? Who is the client that we are working with? Like ultimately the needs, wants, preferences, skills, you know, abilities, capacities, readiness of the client is what determines the approach that we take. And so if I have a client who, let's say, is a highly structured, high performance athlete, they are someone who loves numbers, loves their spreadsheets, you know, finds numbers comforting, just adores external structure and thrives. That's the key word, right? Thrives with external structuring and is prepared to do it for the next, I don't know, month or 2 months before their big competition. That's a great place to use numbers. Although that being said, I have worked with Olympic athletes where intuitive eating was actually fine. Intuitive eating and hand portions was enough. But let's say we have this person, numbers, counting, spreadsheets, all that kind of stuff is a great fit for that person for all of those reasons. And often with the recognition that this is the tool that we use right now, right? And as coaches, we want to have a very robust and variable and flexible toolbox. What am I going to use right now? What am I going to use 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, as people's lives evolve and change and demands come and go? So rather than kind of rigidly adhering to any one tool, we want to be very flexible. So then I have my numbers person, and then maybe I have a client who has a long history of restrictive dieting, and for them, numbers, external cues, weighing and measuring, all that stuff, that's a ticket to crazy town. Right. So for that client, we have a much different approach. And then, of course, there's everything in between, and there's an absolute mixture of everything. And there are times when it's like, maybe for a day or two, I'll track my food just to see what's up. If I have a question, oh, you know what? I don't feel as much energy the last few days. Am I getting enough carbohydrate? Let's just double check and see, right? So we can bring these tools in and out as needed. But I think you made a really astute point. I think this is something you learn in coaching if you've been doing it for long enough, which is that most people don't make it past the base of the pyramid if the rubric for effectiveness is consistency. Because nothing else matters more than that, right? Can my client do the things they need to do to get towards their goal consistently enough to arrive there without being insane? I tell people, like, I only have one nutrition rule, and that's don't be crazy. That's my only nutrition rule. Everything else is on the table, and I'm very agnostic about a lot of things. But can people do all the required behaviors consistently under a variety of circumstances, right? So, it's great when you have that one, like Monday morning, you get up and you're like, oh, everything's going to work, and it works and it's great. And you have a great Monday and you're like, yay, I'm winning my life. And then Tuesday happens and it's a crap circus. The dog barfs on the rug, your mom calls, something happens at work. You know what I mean? So we need to ensure that clients can effectively and reliably execute the behaviors they need to execute, whatever those are, consistently under a whole range of conditions, and that they can adapt flexibly, right? Because that's the other problem with rules. When people are outside the rules, they can't adapt. I think you alluded to that. For me, that is not a robust and resilient system. So yes, maybe I have a client who in the beginning is, really prefers the safety and security of external structure. But over time, I want to give them the skills to build towards feeling more flexible and resilient and adaptable. Because, even if you're a hardcore, highly structured, let's say like a fitness competitor or something like that, there's gonna be a time in your life that is not like that. And you need to deal with that without flipping out, basically, or going completely off the rails in the other direction.
Marissa and I often talk about having things kind of as like a dial, right? Like we talk about competitors and, when they're in contest prep, they turn the dial up and that dial is all the way at 100, 110, but they can't sustain that for many, many months on end. So that eventually they have to turn the dial back down. And that's when they may have like an off season or just kind of like a life period. And that's when they are more flexible, but they're, maybe they take some time off away from tracking and they're able to put into practice what they've learned and have some intuitive days, or just, what you're saying, like, I just, maybe I'll just track my protein, or maybe I just will take the whole week off, or whatever that might be. So we really like that analogy because we can't live at 100 or having that dial all the way up all the time. So I really love that. I have mom brain and I can't think of words. But I love basically what you're saying is that whatever you are following, it does need to be flexible. It does need to be sustainable and something that you can see yourself doing over a long period of time. But when you want to be able to kind of like turn it up, you have the tools in your toolbox to be able to do that.
And, one more piece to add to that, I think we need to put all of this in its proper place, right? When people have their dials turned up to 100 all the time, that becomes their whole personality, right? Like, you do not want to make your nutrition and workouts and all that kind of stuff your entire identity and personality. And like, one of the things I dread, now this hasn't happened since COVID, since nobody has parties anymore, but like I used to dread like going to parties and someone would say like, what do you do? And I would tell them and they'd be like, oh, let me talk for like 25 minutes about this diet that I'm on. And I'm like, I don't care. Can we talk about literally any other interests that you have? And one of the dangers of getting super detailed is that it takes over way more of your life than it should. And it pushes out relationships, hobbies, other interests, literally anything else you could be doing other than weighing and measuring your food. And I think that's kind of an unacknowledged danger. And when we're in the industry, we don't see it as much because it's our job. We talk about it all day long. We think about it all day long. We read nutrition books for fun. Like, it's that kind of stuff. But there is the danger of becoming very unbalanced people, or very tedious people. Like, at the very least, we need one more hobby to talk about at cocktail parties. But less flippantly, like, we've all seen how it can take over people's lives and really occupy way more mental and emotional and logistical real estate than than it should in kind of a healthy, thriving human existence. You know what I'm saying?
Marissa and I will talk about this too, is like when we're talking about lifestyle clients being very specific with their macros, we tell them like, we don't want you guys bringing Tupperware of food to like dinner parties, or, you know, you feel like you can't enjoy the holidays. Like,
yeah, don't be that person.
Yeah, don't be that person. Yeah. So I think that's, God, I really love that. The idea of just like, you don't want that to define you. And like, again, you know, if you're a competitor, that's different. Like you have a competition coming up, you got to be pretty strict, but for the general lifestyle client, like you don't want to be that person.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was kind of like entertaining like a trivial question of like, you know, is there, you know, we're saying we don't want this to define us in our life. We don't want this to be like all encompassing. And obviously that is to pretty much like 99% of everybody who we're talking to on this podcast, right? But I try to think of like, who aren't we talking about? What if there is a person, a population where that is something that they want, that truly fulfills them, that is their entire life's calling? Who is that person? And like the only example I can think of, it's not even like a fitness coach like myself or Christina. It's like, maybe it's the highest level elite athlete where like that is their career and that is what like the only thing that they do. But even then I'm like, I don't know. Right. And so I guess I'm curious. Yeah. I'm just curious, like, how did we get to this conclusion of, because like nutrition, fitness, food, it's an interest, right? And people will build their identities around that often when they shouldn't. But how did we come to the conclusion where that's something that we don't want? You know, I kind of talked about morality, where this is good, this is bad. We're saying it's bad to have that be consuming and all encompassing. I guess I'm curious how we came to that. Because when you think about it, it doesn't apply to really anyone, but where is the line between your nutrition, your fitness being, you know, your personality versus just a part of who you are? I think, because we talk about that a lot, but I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's a concept in the psychology literature called harmonious passion. And the idea is that there are things in life that people are extremely passionate about, even obsessed with, you know, like the people that get obsessed about climbing mountains, or the people that get obsessed with like, I don't know, undergoing some kind of physical challenge, or mastering some kind of incredibly difficult skill, or, you know, whatever, those kinds of things. And there's a place for that. And I think there are also certain kinds of people who are more driven, who are more passionate. Some people would call them obsessive, you know, like whatever word you want to put on it, but who are really fired up about the idea of achieving something, or engaging in some kind of continuous mastery, like always leveling up, always pushing your game, becoming a better musician, whatever it is. And that is a very healthy thing in lots of ways, but it's a razor's edge, right? A harmonious passion can very quickly become a destructive obsession. And we know, like, there are lots of stories where, you know, people died in some kind of mountaineering expedition because they were so driven that like they abandoned logic, right? And there's a very famous, like there's a case of, you know, the mid-90s, there was a massive disaster on Everest where people pushed forward despite knowing that the conditions were dangerous. It's like night's falling, storm is setting in, but like, God damn it, we set a goal, we're going to keep going, right? So the first thing to understand is that there is such a thing as harmonious passion. The second thing is that it's a razor's edge, and you got to be careful with that because it burns you. But the big thing is, the big differentiator is, what effect does this have on my life? And am I okay with the trade-offs that I'm making? So when I experience this harmonious passion, am I thriving? Do I get out of bed every day and like just punch the sky and be like, yes, you know, my life is awesome. I feel great. I am mentally, you know, emotionally, I feel energized. I feel engaged in my life. I feel present. I'm here. My relationships are healthy and supportive. Like, are you thriving in all the domains of life? And if you can say yes, then keep doing whatever the heck you're doing. But the definition of something that becomes disordered, whether that's disordered eating or anything else, is that it starts to harm your daily life function. It harms your relationships. It harms your psychological capacity. It harms your physical capacity, right? It harms your sense of purpose. It harms your ability to just check into the world. So that's really the question to be asking ourselves. Whatever it is I'm doing, am I thriving, or is this interfering with being a healthy, functioning human being? And there are times, you mentioned high performance people, and let me quickly dispel a myth. High performance athletes are not nutrition superstars. They are young people, typically. I sound like such an old person to say this, but they're typically people like in their late teens, early 20s, mid 20s maybe, who have understood that they need to devote a huge proportion of their life to this time limited thing, because they know that this is not a job for life. But they are not very good at their nutrition. They are young people who are traveling, who are busy, who are training, who are tired, who are doing laundry. Like they eat just as much takeout, if not more, than like regular people who are interested in their health, because first of all, they can, they have the genetics and the youth and the training volume on their side. So it's not like elite performers typically are actually nutrition superstars. Sometimes we have to show them, like I had this one guy once, he's probably going to go on to be one of the best UFC fighters. The guy was living on blue cereal. Like, I don't like, what is even blue cereal? Like he used to like it because it made his poop blue. And I was like, what? Like that was his nutrition. It was like a muffin in the morning, a slice of pizza, and blue cereal after training.
Oh my goodness.
And this guy was kicking ass because he was, 18, 19, 20, whatever, and just incredibly gifted. And, so I just, but anyway, so to circle back around, that is the differentiator. Is this thing that I'm engaged in enriching my life? Am I thriving? Is this making me better, like as a human being better in the broadest sense? Or is it making me worse? And sometimes when you're in it, it's hard to know. So it's like good to get feedback from the people around you. Ask your partner, ask your family, ask your friends, like, am I becoming that person? That might be helpful insight for you to have.
I love the idea of thriving, and Marissa and I talk about this too with our clients. Is we want to check in, of course, on their training and nutrition, but we always talk about their quality of life. Like, how are your relationships? Like, how's your mood? Like, how is everything else doing? And it, of course, Marissa and I, because we have competed and we have clients who compete, it makes me think about them, and a lot of them will check in and be like, I'm, snappy with coworkers, or like I'm taking things out on my husband or my spouse. Like, I'm tired. I'm not enjoying my lifts. Like all I think about is competing. All I think about is this. And it's another reason why we can't live at that 110%. So I think that's really, really important. And I'm thinking about that, 1% of those top athletes, where I think sometimes it's really easy to get caught up in like how they look and what they're doing. And it may look like everything is glamorous and everything is so fun for them, but they're doing hours of cardio. Like you're saying, they're being meticulous with their food. They're spending all their time at the gym, and you don't see the fights that they're having with their significant other because they don't have time for anything else. They don't have energy for anything else. They're, hermiting and like all these things. So I think that's thriving. And like, what else are you doing outside? And like, how are your relationships with other people? And so I think that's a really, really great thing to think about.
And I think it's also important to understand, and this is why athletes need coaches, right? Because coaches can plan training and kind of have rest periods and on periods. So when you have a harmonious passion, there will be times when you are in some way being excessive, right? Like when you're 100 meters from the summit of Everest, like giver, like that's the time to just be ridiculous in some way, to bring yourself to the edge of human performance, like go for it. But that has to be balanced with kind of an ebb and flow, right? High performance, like the more performance you want, the more recovery you're going to need, and the more support you're going to need. Like it is almost like a 1-to-1 ratio, if not like 1-to-2, in terms of like needing more recovery. But I don't think people really realize that. They begin to expect that, like, peak performance is called peak performance. There's like a pointy tip to it, right? Like it's not plateau performance. And so people really do need to understand that if you are chasing a crazy thing, that's awesome. But that crazy thing can only occur for a very brief window. And again, this is why a coach is great to have, because then a coach can kind of like, bring you down and bring you back up and engage in those ebbs and flows. And so, yeah, top athletes, when they show up in peak condition, they know it's time limited. and they are hurting. Like they're taped up and they're full of painkillers, and they're willing to trade off health, like wellness health, for performance. And I think we often confuse the look of whatever we think is high performance, or the actual performance itself, with health and wellness. Like, that person is ripped, that must be the peak of health and wellness, when often these things are quite diametrically opposed, especially for women. And I'm imagining that there's a lot of women in your audience. For women in particular, chasing extremes of physical performance comes at a cost. And it's not that women are weaker or anything like that, but if we're talking like hormonal health and kind of like, life mojo, chasing particular kinds of extremes, for women in particular, especially women of reproductive age, can cause significant harm. So it's always a tricky balance, again, and you need to have people in your corner that really know what they're doing, rather than people that are just going to feed you into the sausage grinder and let you get squished.
Yeah, absolutely. I love all those points. And I brought us on this very long, but very good tangent. But I think that's a great point to finish on, but I want to bring us back into kind of what we were talking about with mindful eating techniques, staying at the base of that pyramid, and also dispel a myth that, I'm curious your thoughts on this as well, Krista. We were talking about basically, we need habits that we can be consistent with at the bottom line to get anywhere that we want to go. And in particular, what you said is to get where we want to go, because I think oftentimes we also hear people preach that you can't lose weight if you have a lot of weight to lose, if you are not tracking, or if you are not in a calorie deficit, right? But there's all these things that we do, these habits that create a calorie deficit, whether we're tracking it or not. Obviously, the phrase, you can't manage what you don't measure. This is true, but how much measuring is realistic for a person, and how much can we get away with without measuring, right? How much progress can we make before we take that step? That's kind of where the visual of the pyramid that I have is because there's so much, we can probably get 80% of the way there with just our habits and food quality. And then if that person wants to take that final 20%, then we have to understand what's involved there. But I really wanted to just dispel like the people that say you can't lose weight if you're not tracking, and you have to track to be in a deficit, or you have to track to lose the weight that you want to lose. And just kind of getting into that discussion. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, to lose weight, to lose mass, you have to create an energy deficit. Okay, so let's just get the laws of physics on the table, right? Like, energy in versus energy out is a fundamental concept, and this is just a thing. This is how the universe works that we live in, right? But there's so many ways to get there, right? Like, again, it comes back to having a really big toolbox. And it's interesting because I'm running a small coaching group that's really focused on like stress management and recovery and sleep and that kind of stuff. So there's no discussion of nutrition at all. But what we're finding is that when people purposely focus more on self-care, managing their stress, getting more sleep, they lose weight. So again, we haven't done anything with nutrition. We haven't said anything about what to eat. But somehow people, for whatever reason, are changing their behaviors in ways they may or may not be aware of to create this outcome where their body composition improves. So there's so many pathways to get to a goal, and measuring may be one. And when we say measuring too, there's a lot of different behaviors under that umbrella of measuring. Am I putting things on a food scale? Am I using measuring cups and spoons? Am I using my hand portion method, which we use a lot at PN, which has been tested actually. My wonderful colleague, Brian St. Pierre, who is a former engineer, actually did an analysis on how accurate is this hand portion tracking method? And it was something like 95% concordance with weighing and measuring. So that's pretty darn good for most people. Maybe it was even closer than that. It was extremely close, which I thought was pretty neat.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was super interesting. But, but really what we're talking about when we're talking about measuring is awareness, which is a completely different concept, right? Awareness and quantification. So whether it's oh, I used to eat from the blue bowl Now I'm going to eat from the green bowl, which is smaller. Well, that's a form of measuring, but it's, kind of loosey-goosey, but it may get you where you want to go. Or, even something like having structured meal times. You know what? I tend to snack between, I don't know, 2 and 5. I'm just not going to do that. Oh, I'm aware now that I'm doing it. I'm not going to do it anymore. That changes my behaviors. So like people get, I think, really hung up on the details of particular methods, as they do on the details of particular dietary patterns, and they miss the bigger picture. To lose weight, we have to help people consistently create an energy deficit through like 1,000 different methods. Eat slowly is another great one, right? When you slow people down, they eat less and they feel more satisfied. Like there's so many ways to do this. To get hung up on like, oh, it has to be this way. I think that's not being client-centered, and it's not recognizing the diversity of clients that we have. People, you as a coach, like I said, you need to have a very big and a very versatile toolbox, and you need to be able to switch gears. Like, let's say your client measures for a week and that's going great, and then week 2, week 3, they're like, this is kind of starting to put me in crazy town. You got to abandon that ship. Like, and you have to say, okay, let's go another direction, because I don't want you getting, weird about this. So anyone who's like, well, the only way to do it is blah, blah, has never had enough clients, hasn't been coaching long enough, or is just a crappy coach. Like, if you're going to insist on like a really rigid, like it can only be this one way, that's not how people work. Sorry.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm glad that we got your take on that as well, because I think you just presented more nuance and more perspective there. Like really what it comes down to, I love that you're zooming out with all of this every time. It's like, zoom out. This is about having a toolbox. Zoom out. This is about creating consistent habits, and like always bringing it back to that, because that's ultimately what matters in the long run.
And honestly, one of the best methods I've ever found for helping people lose weight and get in shape, get a dog. It has nothing to do with nutrition. It has nothing to do with, anything else. It's like, but this thing now needs to be walked once or twice a day at least, right? And it has to be done. Otherwise it's going to poop on your floor. Like, more than anything, and people have joy in it, so they feel better, like they're getting connection. Honestly, if I could recommend weight loss intervention, get a dog.
I think there was a study that dog owners are actually something like they weigh less, or they have, I can't remember what the statistic was, but it's like been studied that dogs help you lose weight.
Yep.
That's amazing.
I had a question though, when you were talking about like, obviously in order to lose weight, we need to have an energy deficit, and there are different behavior changes that we can implement for that. And you were mentioning like, oh, let's say I snack between 2 and 5. So, boom, I'm no longer going to do that. Like, we wish it were that easy, right? So like, or like if you tell a client like, oh, you're struggling with this, just do this, like, boom, done.
Just don't do that.
Right. Like, and the clients are like, oh, I've never thought about that before. Totally, like, you're so smart, coach. But like, why is behavior change difficult for some people? Like, if they know that they need to do X, Y, Z, but they're struggling to do that, like, why is it so? And it's not like, I think that sometimes the moralities, like Marissa was saying, like sometimes like, oh, I can't do that, so therefore I am bad at dieting, or therefore I am not good, or I'm a failure. But like, why is it that generally a lot of people have difficulty with that?
Yeah, I mean, such an amazing question, and it really gets at the complexity of human behavior, right? So let me back up a little bit, and let's think about behaviors as kind of like being and doing a few ways. So one of the things behaviors do is they solve a problem. Now, it may be a terrible solution. Like if I'm, if I've had a bad day at work, maybe I'll have a drink and I'll feel better, problem solved. Now, it doesn't solve my problem for more than a few hours. It actually creates more problems. Perhaps, I wake up dehydrated, whatever, right? But in general, any behavior that I am doing is an attempt, unskilled or otherwise, to solve a problem. Behaviors help us cope. Behaviors show us what we value and prioritize, right? So it's like, oh, I need to make more money. I'll work more hours at work, right? I prioritize financial stability, let's say. Also, people don't realize that a lot of our behaviors are mostly instinctive, mostly automatic, mostly patterned, in hilarious ways too. Like if you've ever made some kind of abrupt change in your life, like maybe you sold your car one day you decide, oh, I'm not going to drive a car anymore. Like, you will find yourself months later looking for your car keys, like forgetting that you don't, like, you'll just instinctively reach for your car keys, because so much of our behaviors live in automatic patterns in our bodies, which are facilitated by prompts from our environment. So like, let's take the snacking example. Let's say you work in an office, and every day between 2 and 5 p.m. is the collective snack time. And the receptionist has a jar of candy on their desk, and like, there's always brownies in the break room. Like, your whole environment, and you're bored, like, you're sitting at your desk, you're tired, the fluorescent light is blinking, and you're like, ugh, I don't want to be here, right? Like, your environment is creating, almost inevitably in certain ways, a particular kind of outcome. And I think people don't really realize how few of their behaviors are really like truly willful and intentional and conscious. So what we do in our behavior changes is not even necessarily try to push people one direction or the other, but the first stage we do, and this goes back to measuring, is we start by creating awareness. Because I mean, people have different numbers on how many decisions we make a day. I don't know, a few hundred, few thousand, whatever. But there's like all of these micro crux points throughout our day. Should I do this or that? Should I do this or that? Should I do this or that? This route to work, that route to work. Should I have a sandwich? Should I have lettuce on it? Whatever, right? And so many of those go beneath our radar. But when we start to peel that kind of, cover back and look, oh, I'm making this decision. Oh, isn't that interesting? We often change our behaviors like without even really trying, because it's like, oh, I'm noticing that I'm doing this. You know what? I'm going to pause, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 30 seconds. If we can put a pause between environmental prompts, and that can mean internal environment too. So like, whatever's happening outside of me or inside of me, if there's a prompt coming from there saying, do something, and I pause, that can really help me change my behavior, because it allows me to get off that autopilot and start putting the wise grown-up brain in charge. So the reason it's so hard to change behaviors is for all of these reasons, right? They're so dependent on what's happening inside and out of us, most of which is below our conscious awareness. We often have competing commitments, right? Do I stay on track with healthy eating, or do I relieve stress, right? It's 8 p.m. It's been a really hard day. Do I lie on the couch and watch Netflix? Do I go out for a walk? How do I cope, right? And these commitments to, I want to not be stressed, and I want to do healthy things. Sometimes those come into conflict. We may have competing values, competing priorities, or we don't have the skills to regulate ourselves, right? Like, I'm so amped up right now. I need to do something to relieve this discomfort that I'm experiencing. Okay, you know what? I'm going to eat, because that's the only skill that I have in this moment to regulate myself. So there's like a million reasons why it's hard to change behavior, but I think it's almost like behavior change is hard because behaviors are hard. Behaviors are complicated. And so as coaches, we almost like have to start pulling out threads one by one to go, okay, can we intervene here? Can we change your environment? Can we change your internal environment? Can we help you learn to self-regulate? Can we build other activities in? Typically, it's harder to extinguish a behavior or inhibit a behavior than to do something else that replaces it. So, for example, it's a lot easier for me in the evenings to say, I'm going to call someone I really want to talk to, or I'm going to do a hobby that I really love and find super engaging, than to say, I'm not going to eat in the evening. I'm going to stop eating. Does this make sense, what I'm saying here? It's a lot easier to be pulled towards something you really want to do versus pushed away from something that you don't want.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I love that.
There is so much in what you just said that, like, I want to just pull apart and dissect every single piece and talk about this for hours and hours, but we can't do that. But one thing that, like, my mind gravitated to, that's been a very big focus of ours, just with our team and our clients lately, is kind of like breaking apart, what you said, where the first step in all of this is, let's create awareness. And so we create awareness, which is basically just implementing how do we become more mindful of what are we currently doing, because then the two trajectories that come from that we then have to deal with is, are we then mindful and judging ourselves, or are we mindful and accepting what is? And so something that we really focus on, and again, this is only one piece of this very, very complex puzzle, and I've been sitting here as you were talking trying to like draw out exactly like all the different pieces in the web of like everything that contributes to behavior. But we have to sit there and think, okay, like if we are now aware, this usually goes in one of two ways for people. They start to judge themselves, which then leads to, judgment, shame, guilt, and then probably for a lot of people, self-sabotaging behaviors to cope with those feelings of guilt and shame and anxiety and frustration that they then feel as an internal cue. And then that brings us back into that loop. Or, and this is where we try to get to, is accepting what is, having neutrality with like, this is what I have been doing. I have mindfulness over this, which now gives people the realization that they are also personally responsible for these things that they've been doing. And so it's very hard not to fall into that judgment trap. But if we can get somebody to a place to, I accept what is, then we can have more thoughtful action moving forward. So there's even a lot in just that, but something that we've been focusing on a lot and that we talk about a lot in this podcast is just really starting to analyze, like, how do we speak to ourselves, and like, are we speaking to ourselves with judgment, and how can we facilitate change in that? Because if we can do that, we're well on our way away from the toxic pattern and much closer to how do we actually take thoughtful action on how do I change the way that I'm feeling, or how do I change the behavior in this environment or whatnot. So that's something that really came up for me, that I was like, man, there's a lot, but I think that is something I wanted to bring up.
And we talk a lot about, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that's definitely worth highlighting. Like if people get nothing else from this podcast, that's so worth highlighting. And in fact, compassion is the first 5. We have this idea of like the first 5 of coaching, right? There's lots of coaching techniques and methods and approaches out there. But if you could only pick 5, it's like one of those things where you have to go to a desert island. You have to go to a desert island. You can only pick 5 coaching methods. Compassion is number 1. It is the prime directive of how we coach and how we encourage people to, like, what we encourage people to cultivate in themselves. Because if you are under threat, you cannot change. Like, you will regress to previously patterned behaviors and very primal kind of like instinctive defensive behaviors. So like the first order of business is offering compassion, whether that's to ourselves or to our clients, because without that empathy and care and support and soothing and regulation, co-regulation, we just can't change. So like, you have all these people who are like, oh, but if I don't criticize myself, how am I going to know what to fix? I'm like, well, if self-criticism worked, we would all be friggin' superstars. Like, we would all be Olympic symphony musicians, like whatever, we would be amazing A+ humans. It doesn't, has criticism ever worked? It's like, has this worked for you for the last 50 years of your life? No. So how about we try something else? And an experiment that I invite people to try is like, okay, look, maybe you want to be a jerk to yourself, forever. That's cool. But why don't you take a week or even a day and play a game of self-compassion and really celebrating some wins. Like, yay, I drank a glass of water today, self-high five kind of thing. Good for me. Oh, I'm having a hard day. You know what? I'm going to be nice to myself, whatever that looks like. Do that for a day, a couple of days, a week. And then try criticism. Like, super double down on that. Like, tell yourself you're an asshole and a sack of crap and all that stuff, right? Like, really go hard on this one and see what happens in your behaviors, in your mood, in your willingness to engage with, your goals, like all of that stuff, your motivation. Which one has the better outcome? And that will reveal your answer. So you're absolutely bang on that compassion has to be at the heart of everything we do, even for high performance people. And this is something I really need to stress. It's like, as performance demands go up, support has to go up too. And otherwise we see things like, top athletes having mental health issues, just cracking under the pressure, because it's like the demands are so intense that they will break even the most resilient human if you don't have that compassion and that care and that support. So let me pause there. Christina, I kind of interrupted you there.
No. I had two things. So number one, when what you were just saying, it's the exact same example. I feel like in like a relationship with your spouse, like significant other, if you want to create behavior change in them, try criticizing them. Like, you never do the dishes, you suck at this, like, I hate when you do, if you're negative all the time, like they're probably just going to resent you. Whereas if you're like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for thinking of me when you did this, or thank you so much for doing the dishes, or whatever it might be, like if you praise so much more, you're going to elicit more behavior change. Whereas if you are so negative towards them. So I feel like it's the same thing with yourself. Like if you're constantly negative, you're not going to have a very good relationship, or, whatever, and just be more positive. So I love that example that you brought up. But what I was going to say too, earlier, talking about Marissa's example, is we often talk about the growth versus fixed mindset too, and how much that plays into behavior change as well. Whereas if you're just fixed and you're like, well, I suck at this, so therefore, like, I'm never going to lose weight, or I'm not going to be able to do this, versus having that kind of like openness to like, I may not be good at this yet, or just again, having that compassion with yourself and know that you are constantly evolving and you can change, and you may just need the skills or the behavior, and you might need someone to help you through whatever phase that you might be in. So that was like 10 minutes ago or 5 minutes ago. But we love bringing that up because we do think it is so important.
For sure. And it's funny you say that, because out of our first 5, growth mindset is number 2, because growth mindset kind of naturally flows from compassion. Once you offer yourself compassion and kindness, then you start to go, oh, like maybe I'm not such a terrible human being, and maybe I could get better at something. And so, it really just naturally flows from that. And then once you have a growth mindset, you have a solution focus, like, oh, maybe there are solutions to this, right? So there's, it is a very kind of beautiful flow. And I think something else for folks to understand that would be helpful is that we tend to translate human problems into personal failures, right? Like, oh, I'm struggling with this. I must suck as like a unique individual, and no one else, can possibly be struggling with this. But the fact is, it's like, so many of these things come from like, this is just how brains work. So it's like, well, why do I get hungry after not having eaten for a while? Because hypothalamus, like that's how this works, right? So like people blame themselves so much for just very natural, normal, universal processes of physiology and psychology and neuroscience, right? So like, people are like, oh, like why do I get distracted? Why does anything happen? Because brains, right? Like because bodies. And I mean, there was this great psychotherapist called Irvin Yalom who said, the most personal is the most universal. So whatever you're struggling with and are like absolutely convinced that this is evidence of like your unique special brokenness, is always a human problem or a human concern, or just not even a problem, because so many of these things that we struggle with are only problems in context, right? So like if I want to lie around on the couch and not exercise, that makes so much sense in an evolutionary context. Why would I expend energy if I don't have to, right? Or why do I like things that are fatty or sweet or rich? Because they're energy dense, and if I eat them, I don't die. So, and so like, yeah, in 2022, a lot of these beautiful evolutionary mechanisms are maladaptive. They don't help us now, but they sure as heck helped us, a million years ago or 100,000 years ago or whatever. So like, that's I think a really, really key piece. Nobody is uniquely broken. They're just sloppy human beings, trying to make their Stone Age bodies fit into a 21st century reality. And that's hard to do a lot of the time.
And I wonder too, if social media has anything to do with that too, is because we see this highlight reel. And it sometimes can feel like no one else is struggling because it looks like, oh, that person, their life is so perfect, or, they have everything under control. So I wonder if that has something to do with it as well.
Oh, yes. I'm sure that that's true. And we've talked about misconceptions around, athletes or high performers or people who compete. I mean, I think the world is just full of misconceptions about how things work or how things should be. And So, one of our greatest infographics at Precision Nutrition is called the cost of getting lean.
Mm.
So a lot of people, love this infographic because they're like, oh, I didn't realize that what it takes to get exceptionally ripped, jacked, swole, whatever, took this amount of trade-offs or this amount of effort. And that's not a problem with those people that think that. It's kind of an informational issue because our industry, I think, explicitly or implicitly communicates that, hey, all you have to do is 20 minutes a day of whatever, or like eat this way and you're going to look like this. It's like, it doesn't work like that. But most people don't know that. And again, it's not the fault of those people. It's the message that we get communicated. I saw an ad on Instagram that was like, optimize your life in 3 minutes a day. I was like, what even is that? Like, that's just insane. Or, I mean, it reminds me of that scene from Zoolander where it's like, you can't have 4-minute abs. Like, it's just, but that's the message that we get. And so people have a lot of misconceptions about how this works. And, as someone who's older too, I see how so many expectations are derived from idealizing bodies that are super young. And again, having worked with young athletes, they are like, I'd say, they're like carburetors. Like, you can put so much stuff in them and they still look amazing because they're 18, 19, 20, right? Like, they can have breakfast of Pop-Tarts and vodka and still be swole and ripped because they're young. But the downside is, the trade-off for them is, if they don't learn to eat well at that phase of life, they get to their 30s and they're like, oh my God, what's happening? It's so traumatic because they don't have that, that freebie of youth anymore. But I think that's also a very unacknowledged piece, that there's such huge differences as we go through the lifespan that are really not reflected, I think, in kind of, again, those expectations around like, how do things work?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to kind of finish us off here because we're definitely running out of time, but I do want to talk about one problem in context, like you said, that a lot of people will attribute their unique brokenness to, which is overeating or stress eating or binge eating or whatever you want to call it. But I mean, I think, just kind of to sum it up as well, like, a lot of what we've talked about has explained the roots of overeating, whether it's environment, internal stimuli, external stimuli, judgment, and self-sabotaging behaviors. So I don't think we necessarily need to dig too far into that again, but this is something that I did really want to cover in terms of just conquering overeating or becoming more aware of those patterns, because I read an article that you wrote, and I have no idea when you wrote it, but it was in the Precision Nutrition coursework, and it was just like 5 different steps you can take to get better with your overeating habits. And the funniest thing is, like, the first one was like, just let yourself overeat, like just give yourself permission and watch what happens. And that's actually something that I've told a few clients as well, where I was just like, okay, so you have like this event coming up on the weekend, you're worried you're going to overeat and all that. And it's like, it's the paradigm shift of, I'm going in trying to restrict everything and stay within my calories or whatever, to I'm going to allow myself to eat whatever I want, and I'm going to be satisfied with that, and I'm going to be okay with the consequences or whatever comes of it. And just the shift of like, I no longer feel guilt and shame, therefore I behave differently. So that was like a great one, where that was like the first one that came up. I think I laughed out loud because I was like, yes, like just say yes to it every now and again. But yeah, let's dig into kind of what are those tactics to start working with those overeating and binge eating patterns.
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think the first thing I would say is, a lot of people judge themselves not just for the behaviors, but for the thoughts and the feelings around those behaviors, right? So, accepting the whole package, I think, is a huge thing. So accepting that you will feel a desire to do something, or you will feel a craving, because a lot of people are like, how do I get rid of cravings? And it's like, well, sometimes there's things you can do. Like, sometimes we can adjust your nutrition so that you're not experiencing cravings. We can meet your nutrient and energy needs in a certain way. But a lot of the time, being hungry is part of being human. Wanting to eat is part of being human. Wanting to eat delicious foods is part of being human. Wanting to eat more when you're in a stressful situation, because eating and food helps regulate us physiologically and psychologically, is a normal part of being human. And so people listening, I don't want to imply that we say like, screw it, do whatever. Like, that's not the approach we're talking about. What we're talking about is saying it's the perception of constraint and the preoccupation with doing the right thing, and the consequences, the punishment, the self-punishment for doing the wrong thing, that is the problem. Whereas if you said, look, I'm going to honor the experience that I'm having and create some awareness around that and put some space in between that, right? So first I'm going to allow myself to experience all of the thoughts, the feelings, the sensations that go with this desire to overeat or to binge eat. Then I'm going to pause and bring some awareness to that and some intention. And then I'm going to decide, like in a very conscious, aware way, what I'm going to do next. And that's where we can kind of say to people, well, you have a lot of options on your plate, so to speak, right? You can honor your experience, you can create the awareness, and then you can decide to, take yourself out of the situation. You can decide to eat slowly and be very present with the experience. You can decide that it now is the time you're going to soothe your stress with your eating behavior. Like, there's a whole lot of decisions that are available to you, but what they all have in common is that you are now intentional about them. You are compassionate, you are accepting of the thoughts and the feelings, rather than being punitive and being fear-based and being rule-based. And so I think that's really the critical distinction. So for some people, paradoxical intention works really great. And what I mean by that is, like, do you remember when you were a kid and like there was some food that was off limits, right? And you were like, when I grow up, I'm going to buy all of that. I'm going to eat it all for every meal all the time, right? Like, I don't know, let's say it's jelly beans, right? And you're like, I'm going to eat jelly beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and you can't stop me because I'm going to have a job. I'm going to have money to do that, right? And then it's like, okay, cool, I'm an adult now, and I'm going to do it. And you do it, and you're like, like, it's the forbiddenness that actually makes it appealing. But when nothing is off limits, for a lot of people, so there's an initial period of like, yay, jelly beans all the time. And then like after an hour or a day or 2 days, they're like, ugh, they kind of hit that hedonic threshold where they're like, okay, this is not spinning the dials anymore. So when we take forbiddenness and badness off the table, a lot of the time for people, in a way, that's enough to kind of, it's weird. It's like, yeah, you know what? Eat ice cream for breakfast. I don't give a crap. And then people are like, it was so weird. I sat down and I really wanted to have ice cream for breakfast because I decided I wanted to. And I just couldn't make myself do it. I had oatmeal instead, right? So it's a funny, weird brain thing that happens. It's a very well-known cognitive behavioral technique of saying, hey, listen, if you're worried about XYZ, go and do XYZ extra hard. And people often find that they can't. So there's something about the forbiddenness of that when you remove the forbiddenness, when you remove the judgment, when you remove the criticism and all the morality, it's like, oh, I actually didn't even want to do that. I only wanted to do it because I was off limits. It's like, when you're a little kid and your sister or brother has a toy and you're like, I didn't even want that toy until you picked it up. And now I want it.
Oh gosh, I love that. And that's one of the reasons, and I'm sure a lot of coaches are like this too, but Marissa and I, because we have the same approach with almost absolutely everything. We don't have a restrictive approach when it comes to eating for that reason. Because normally, like most people, it's like, oh, diet starts one day and they cut out alcohol and sugar and all this stuff because they can't have it because they're dieting. And then by the weekend, they're like, oh man, I haven't had this Monday through Friday. So Saturday, I'm just going to binge on this. Whereas we're like, well, if you like ice cream, like, why don't you have a little bit of it? Like, why don't you end your night with a little bit of ice cream? The next night you can have it too. And, sometimes by like the weekend, they're like, man, I've had ice cream every single day this week. I don't really want it anymore. There was a book I was reading, and And this woman, she was in the US and she was in her early 20s, and she went to go visit a cousin in like Italy or something. And her cousin was also in her young 20s, and they were going to meet up for going out at night. She's like, oh, I can't wait to go out with my cousin. This is going to be so much fun. We're going to drink all this alcohol. And her cousin was like, I don't really want to do that. And she's like, what do you mean? Like, we're 21, like, let's go. And she's like, well, I've been, drinking since I was 18, and it's, something I've always been able to do. It's not this like, oh, I'm 21, like now I get to do it. It's because it's not forbidden there. So, I mean, there's so many things that we go into when it comes to alcohol, but
that's a great example.
That forbiddenness. And a lot of people, like when they get to college, it's like, oh, I haven't been able to do this because I've been in high school. And now it's like, I'm going to go crazy, versus like, if it was just something that you've been able to do, it's like, oh, alcohol is just alcohol. It's like not a huge deal. So I really, really love that mentality. And it's almost like the opposite of what you'd expect, like a health and fitness person to be like, yeah, go binge, like have at it. Yeah, have fun.
Yeah, and I mean, part of that too, the awareness piece, I think, is really a critical component of what makes the magic here, right? And so with clients, I would often say like, okay, listen, if you're going to binge or overeat, that's cool, man. Like, go ahead and do it. If that's what you feel you need to do in order to regulate, like that's a kind of a key component, like to kind of to frame it as an issue of self-regulation. But just do it slowly. So if you want to eat that whole carton of ice cream, knock yourself out. Just do it really slowly and enjoy it. Like, be present with that. Like, if you're going to eat that ice cream, like have a great experience, like really commune with that, that ice cream. Right. And when people slow themselves down, that's again, when the wise mind is able to get into the driver's seat and say, hey, you know what? We've had some ice cream. Like, okay, we're kind of over it now. So, but it's so weird for people to hear like, oh, I'm allowed, like coach is giving me permission. Like even the whole concept of permission is bizarre, because I tell my clients, like, permission is for small children and people in jail. Like, we are not, like, even the word compliant, right? We don't use the word compliant anymore. We use consistency. Were you consistent? Were you, did you, like, we use words around like, were you able to repeat a behavior effectively? Not, did you follow the rules? Because compliance like creates powerlessness. And so as much as possible, I think one of you said the word responsibility, as much as possible, we want to give our clients accountability, but in a healthy adult way. And a lot of our job is actually helping clients grow up, like to do developmental tasks of adulthood, which includes things like, intentionality, choicefulness, not following rules. Like, the only rules, I mean, I'm sort of a rule avoider person, but like there's rules that we should follow, right? Social contract kind of rules, like let's all agree to stop at a red light. Those are good rules. Let's all have those rules. But there are other rules that are really quite unnecessary for functioning adult human beings. And so with clients, a lot of time, there's a lot of issues around permission. And I'm like, okay, we need to bring you into the space of maturity where you are driven by your own values and your inner compass, rather than seeking permission from me as the coach. So in the beginning, as they're transitioning, I might write them a permission slip. Like, here's your permission slip. You get to do X, Y, and Z. And they're like, yay! Like, their 6-year-old self is like, yay, I get to go on the field trip. But they can't stay at that phase forever. Eventually, we need to transition to becoming accountable adults. And that's really, part of the process, to know that you could buy jelly beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and that could be your choice if you wanted. But, maybe let's try it a different way with awareness.
Yeah. If I could sum that up, I mean, the only person's permission that you really need to make a decision about your behavior is your own. And I think a big part of this process is helping people get to a place where they can give themselves permission to make the choices that align with what they want out of, what, and a lot of times that's not what people come into a coaching program to do, right? They think, I want 25.623 pounds of weight loss, and I will not settle for anything less. And then they realize maybe they've lost 10 and they're like, wow, everything in my life is great. And I have balance and flexibility. And, I feel like this pressure to keep going because I said something, but I need to give myself permission to like be okay with where I'm at now, because everything else points to I'm super happy. So I definitely think the concept of permission, how you broke that down was really interesting. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, people need to be giving themselves that rather than seeking it externally.
Which is a developmental process, right? Like you can't just sort of shove people off the diving board and be like, have fun. It is a process of skill building. And you kind of implicitly brought up something else, which I think is worth mentioning. If you have never taken yourself to the extreme of performance or body composition, you do not know that when you're there, it sucks, right? Or it doesn't answer the questions that you wanted answered, or it doesn't solve the problems that you wanted solved. In fact, it usually creates more problems. And I think if you haven't experienced that directly, the world of having abs, let's call it, seems like a magical place, right? Where you have confidence and all these things, these great things happen for you. But if you've been to that land, you're like, oh, that actually was not at all what I expected. And in fact, in a way, it was often more disappointing because maybe I did get there. And I realized to my shock and sadness that all my problems weren't solved. And in fact, some of them were worse. And it's like, oh, wow. So, as coaches, we need to be really clear with people, like whatever physical destination you get to is not going to answer all of the questions that you wanted answered. And if there are skills or if there's a way that you want to feel, because ultimately 25 point whatever pounds is a proxy for, I want to feel X, Y, and Z, right? If you want to feel X, Y, and Z, more confident, more this, whatever, let's work on that now, along with the physical piece. Because I guarantee you, if you don't work on the feelings, the physical piece is never going to get you there. I mean, it might get there's things, again, it might get you there by accident. Maybe you confront a challenge and you gain confidence that way. But if you're hoping that the physical change alone, if you're hoping that 25 pounds is going to magically change your life, no, it's not gonna. Sorry.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Dr. Gabrielle Fundero?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she works with us sometimes.
Yeah, she was on our podcast probably a few months ago at this point. Wow. But one thing that she said, one thing she said on our episode that has stuck with me ever since was just your body image can change without your body changing, and your body can change without your body image changing. And it's definitely, it can be mutually exclusive. It can also not be, but identifying those things as separate and working on them individually so that they can come together is like the most important thing when it comes to really figuring out what you actually want at the end of the day. Cool. I love that. So I kind of want to wrap up here, and I don't want to take too much more of your time because I really appreciate obviously everything you've given us so far. But we do ask one final question to every single guest on this podcast. Christina, you're always the one that does it. So take it away.
Sure. So our podcast is all about being sustainable. That's the number one thing we like to preach with our clients. So if you could offer one piece of advice or the number one tip that you have for living a healthy and sustainable lifestyle, what would that be?
It's loaded. It's a loaded question.
A healthy and sustainable lifestyle. I would give sort of a two-part answer. I would say, figure out what your values and priorities are, recognizing these will change through your life. But what are your what is your inner compass? Where is that pointing to right now? Do the work to discover what that is for you, because often it takes some digging, and you might need help from a mentor or counselor or whatever. But number one, recognize, understand, and abide by what your values and priorities are. Understand where your inner compass is pointing you. Like, what is your deeper truth? And that's hard, because our deeper truth is sometimes not what external truth is or social truth is. It's like, oh my God, my inner compass is pointing me this way. Society is pointing me this way, but I don't want to go that way. My inner compass is pointing me this way. So piece number one, understand, recognize, honor what those deeper values are for you, and then put it into practice by finding very, very, very tiny versions of that you can do every single day or as many days as possible, no matter what. In my coaching group, we call it the 1%, right? What's your 1%? If you have this particular value, let's call it confidence, or it's not really a value, but like, I don't know, being a good role model for my kids, that's a value, let's say. Okay, how can you 1% more that today? Maybe it's like, I listened to my kid tell me about trains for 30 more seconds or 1 more minute, right? Or, I spend a little extra, like 2 more minutes of snuggle time or something like that. But like, what is my value? What is my deeper value? And then today, how can I 1% better that value? And then tomorrow I ask myself the same question. Could be a different action, could be the same action. But if we think about the principle of compound interest, right? 1% better every day, 1%, 1%, 1%, that adds up to a pretty awesome life. And it also allows organic shifts in your values, which will happen over the course of your life. So yeah, that's what I would say. Don't expect to lock it into cruise control and stay there. Allow ebbs and flows, because that's what sustainability is too, right? It's got to be resilient. It's got to be flexible. It's got to change as you change, which is going to happen. So yeah, deeper values plus 1%. There's your formula.
I love that. Kind of like little micro habits.
Nano habits. Yeah.
Yeah. I love it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was so great. This is definitely going to be one that I go back and listen to again, just because I feel like there are just so many little nuggets. And we absolutely appreciate you coming on, and you are a very special guest. And there was definitely so much more that I feel like we could dive into and talk about. So I'm sure that you're going to be a repeat guest if you would love to come back on. But Marissa, do you have anything else that you want to? No? Okay, awesome. Well, guys, we hope that you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit. Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Krista, where can they find you?
Same deal. Instagram at Stumptuous. Facebook, just look for Krista Scott-Dixon. There's only one of me as far as I know. Precision nutrition, you'll find lots of my writing. Just honestly Google Krista Scott-Dixon and you will find tons, because there's only one Krista Scott-Dixon.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.